It is a recording.
Thank you very much, and hello to everybody, especially to all of you that are having early morning or late afternoon or evening. Thanks for joining. So this will be our second webinar about OPC router training. This day it will be about how to work with templates and instances, because this is a basic feature, but not everybody knows how to use it. That's why we decided to schedule a webinar to show you some practical examples how you can use this standard feature. In the beginning, I will just mention a very few slides, maybe 2 or 3 minutes, about OPC router for those of you who are not so familiar with OPC router or haven't heard much about it already. Before we start, I just want to tell you that this session will be recorded. So if you should drop out due to technical issues, or if you would like to review the webinar afterwards, please just send me an email to sales@inray.de and I will send you out the recording. Or if you're not located in Germany and in another country, then you can go on our OPC router websites and look for your local distributor and ask them, and then they will also be happy to provide you with the recordings of the webinar. To make sure that we have a very good user experience with that webinar and a good performance, it would be great if you would all please turn off your cameras. As far as I can see, nobody has activated its camera, which is great. And it would be nice if you also would please mute your microphone until you are not speaking, so that we can avoid some background echoes and noises. So thank you very much. And I think we're ready to go. As said, a very, very short introduction to OPC router. For those of you who don't have much experience with OPC router, because also the name OPC router might be a bit misleading. That's what we've learned over the last years, because people think an OPC router is something that only can work with OPC protocol, and the router is maybe a hardware device, a hardware router. Both of this is not the case. So OPC router is not a hardware solution. It's a software-based communication platform, so a pure software solution, which is running on a server or computer. It offers lots of available plugins and connections. So it can speak OPC, it can act as an OPC server and an OPC client, but it also can connect to systems like SAP, special databases, cloud systems, printers, RFID systems, barcode readers, etc., etc. So OPC is, I think, in most projects still used, but it's not necessarily needed to work with OPC router. So you can also, for example, just have a connection between SAP and your email system, or between a Domino printer and a Telegram messenger. Overall, OPC router can connect both shop floor and top floor systems. And yeah, I will come to that in a few seconds. So why using OPC router, or what makes OPC router special and unique? There are of course some arguments. Of course, you can save time using that software tool, and so on and so on. But there are two criteria, I think, which make in that combination OPC router pretty unique. The first is really the ease of use of the software, because you can really connect different kind of systems just via drag and drop. So you don't need to be a automation expert or an IT expert. You can use a graphical user interface, and you just can, via drag and drop, place your boxes for connectivity, draw some arrows with a mouse, and then your connections are ready to go, are set up so that you can use them. So it's really pretty simple to use. And the other main argument, I think, is still the number of available plugins. So it's not only a router which can connect to 2 or 3 different kind of systems. There are more than 39 different protocols and plugins available for OPC router, which can connect hundreds of totally different systems using these native and standard plugins for connectivity. And that's also pretty unique to have this this broad variety of systems that you can connect with each other bidirectionally. And before Jan jumps into the training, just a quick example how such connections could look like. So what you can see here are some of the available plugins for OPC router. And OPC router can enable bidirectional communication between all these kinds of different systems. So we have customers that are connecting their field systems like a PLC or a controller with a database. So that's a very simple use case. As OPC router itself is not speaking any field bus protocols like Modbus or Profibus or Profinet, we are using Kepware OPC server to translate all these kinds of different protocols into OPC, and then we can use our OPC client to read the data from Kepware and send it to a database. Pretty simple use case, but still used very often. But what you also can do is to create some kind of process and while connecting different kind of systems. So for example, the PLC gets to know that a production order has been finished, so it sends an information to SAP or any other ERP solution, which can be Microsoft Dynamics or Infor or Oracle or whatever. So it sends an information to the ERP system and downloads or reads the production information for the next production order. So that information goes down to the shop floor, to the PLC. Maybe there's also a handshake, so that the PLC sends back a short signal to the ERP system that it has received the information properly and is starting the production now. After starting the production, maybe there's a packaging line and the PLC is sending some product information to the label printer. And maybe there could be an issue with that printer. So for example, it's running out of labels, it's running out of ribbon, there's a network failure or connection failure to the printer, and OPC router could recognize that and then automatically send out an email or a telegram messenger to a maintenance guy to fix that issue. So these kinds of connections of different systems in a process or in parallel is possible using OPC router. So that's what makes that software pretty special. But that should be it as an introduction. And now I would like to hand over to my colleague Jan, who will lead you to the training session about how to work with OPC router templates and how to create instances. Jan, the stage is yours.
All right, thank you. So yeah, first of all, welcome everybody, also from my side. As Thorsten said, I will do the training on template instances in OPC router. First of all, I will start showing my screen. So everybody should be able to see my screen now. It's the OPC router configuration, actually. So yeah, just generally at the introduction, on top here we have some settings, basic settings for the OPC router. Important is some important points are the ability to import or export router projects. So whenever you have set up a project, you can just make a copy of it and then transport it to another server or just for testing purposes, exported it. You have access to log files, and then you have the extras where you have settings. This includes basic settings. In the very beginning, they are by default correct, so do not necessarily have to be changed. But for example, the storage time is often sometimes changed by customers because all transferred values are for analysis purposes stored in a local DB. So you may want to change that to a decent value so your database is not growing too much, as well as the log size. So there are some general settings here when you start with OPC router. You can also have send emails for connections you created. You have the certificate store. Usually you only use the client certificates here. So whenever you have encrypted communication as a client application to a server, then you exchange your certificates, and this is where you set up the OPC router certificate. So our certificate storage, as well as redundancy settings. So the basic settings are interesting to know. Some of them are useful. You further have the expert mode. From time to time, it is necessary to switch to the expert mode in order to have more parameters to choose when setting up the communication to source or destination systems. So, for example, if you go to expert mode, then you can have the ability to go to the database settings here in file, and then you can reset the whole system here. So whenever you export your system and then you do stuff to test it, and once you want to go back to the first state, you can delete everything and then re-import your project. So whenever you go to expert mode, this can be helpful. So another point is show transfer steps. When you start in the very beginning using OPC router, this option is very helpful to see in what order the transfer steps within a connection are executed. So in the beginning, it's useful to go to information and check this show transfer steps or use Control and F10. But basically, regardless the general settings up here, what you do when you use the OPC router is you have the options here on the left side. So starting up here, plugins. This is where you administrate the settings for the systems that you want to communicate with. The next point is actually the menu point where you create connections that are then executed. Today, we will be looking at this particular menu point here. And this is where you create templates. And from templates, you create instances. And this is what we are looking for. Next one would be here on the left hand, the part where you set a connection productive. So, and finally, the state menu here. So the OPC router is divided into two parts. You have an application, a Windows application, running in the user mode in which you are authenticated to Windows. You create connections here or as templates. Once you have done that, you activate them, because when you activate connections, they are passed to the runtime. And the OPC router service runtime is running as a Windows service. And every change that you make to a connection or a new connection needs to be activated or set productive in order to land here in the state. This is actually where you have an overview about what is the runtime doing when executing connections. So we start here in templates. As always, you can have folders here to just give it a structure. For the very beginning, I would just create a template, because we're only setting up one template in this session. So I just go ahead and say right-click or use the button icons up here and say new template. Then I give it a name, say, yeah, my or template process data. So the first thing is it opens here a tab. So in this area is where you actually create connections, completely similar to the usual way of creating connections. We use templates for basically two purposes. One is for mass generation of data collection. So if you have thousands of connections in order to collect data, basically in the same way, you would use this template function. But also if you have, for example, an M.A.C. application where you send production order data to a machine, and you have 100 machines in your company, and they are all PLCs are programmed in the same way. So you would always basically transfer the same kind of data. You could also use a template because it's always the same, just some placeholders or variables change for each instance. So that's the two purposes where we use templates. And you use it the same way as you do it with regular connections if you want. On the right hand, you have your transfer objects. So I will do the example with OPC data change trigger. So I put it here. When I double click it, I have to specify the OPC server. In this case, I only have one, so I just choose it. And then you have to specify the trigger item. Actually, this is the place where each instance from this template is different because every instance has a different data point on the OPC server to transfer. So this is the first time where we use a variable or a placeholder if you want. And it can be done either by an internal function of OPC router. Everywhere where you see a plus, you can just go ahead and say, click it. Then OPC router creates a placeholder. You don't have to do it this way. You can also imagine you have many more places where you have to create placeholders. Then this OPC address name wouldn't be descriptive enough. So you can also define your own placeholder names. This would be by saying add, and then let's say OPC item path. You define the kind of data type. In this case, since it's the namespace, it's obviously a string. And in this case, you would drag and drop it here. So this is a little, you have to get used to it, how to operate with it. Usually, I guess you have more complex templates in the real world application than this I'm showing. So you may want to use your own template variables. For the purpose of this training, I will just go ahead and say, let OPC router put the name of the placeholder. So this is the only thing that is different to a regular connection. You have the plus signs. Everywhere where you see it, you can have a placeholder. Make the connection dynamic. So, and I say, okay, I want to trigger at each data change, and I need the metadata to some extent, and say, okay, so now I have a regular data change trigger. Only difference, there's a placeholder up here. So now I choose a database transfer object, and I prepared a connection to a local DB, the SQL Express training database. And I want to do an insert to a certain table. The table can also be dynamic here. So during runtime, you can pass a table here and then make an insert. Very helpful when it comes to dynamic SQL programming. That's kind of advanced. So here you have some possibility to have a dynamic table to be chosen during runtime. In this case, I'm just saying I'm using my fixed table, and I'm not going to choose the ID and the time resolution, but yeah, I will use the rest. I don't have any validity checks. And I say, okay, so now I can match my columns with the OPC values. Okay, I don't need the quality string, I think. Yeah, okay. We leave the quality string, but the time is okay, and the item name. The config ID, I will use a constant values for it. So this is supposed to be a value that uniquely identifies a measurement value, a process value from the OPC server by a number. You can also use the item name, but yeah, for this example, I'm choosing both. So the name is, of course, the same. And since it's an integer, I choose the data type to be integer. And then I can drag and drop it. So then I do the matching. And that's it. I have two placeholders, the OPC address and the config ID for this simple example. So now nothing basically happened. What I have to do in the next step is I can choose this icon up here or make a right mouse click. And there are three different ways to create instances from a template. The first one, it's the simple one, create instance from template. So when I choose it, there's a dialog coming up, and then I have to give it a name. So my first one is the name of my instance is current temperature. I specify the template that I want to use for it, because there can be multiple. Then a location folder for where I want to store it. And then the OPC address I have copied here. So here I specify the namespace to the OPC tag, which is current temperature here. And then I give it a config ID 1, for example. So I can either say create when I'm done or say okay and new. And then you see it creates a connection in my connections folder. So then I will do another one, current amount. Use the same here. Then of course I have to change it here, the name, and give it another config ID. So I can now go ahead or just create. And once I've done that, in my connections, I have now two connections, but they are not, they have this arrow that is a little different to the other one. So you can see that this is a created instance. They're not passed to the runtime. It's the same way as with regular connections. So you always have to go here and say, okay, those two, I want to activate them and go ahead. So at some point it will start here, and in my runtime status view, I now have two connections. So when I open one, it should at some point connect to the OPC server. And start. So now we're having transfers up here, and we're going to go to my SQL Express training database, the table, and then process value. I can just make a select and see they're coming in here. So now they're coming in, just the same way as it would be to use a regular connection. So whenever I do a change to to the template, then it will be passed on to all instances from that template. That makes it so helpful. So first of all, any changes is then cascaded down to every connection. And the second one is the mask generation. So I will now just use those two. I can either delete or deactivate them the same way as you're used to it with the regular connections. In this case, I would just delete it. And then tell the runtime that they were deleted. And now in the status, it's empty. And if I now here, I will delete everything. So now the table is empty again. So the next way to do it, I want to have, this is sort of the point where you have this mask generation. So if you don't want to do it manually by create instance from template, you have multiple instances here. And this is a completely different dialog. This is like an Excel sheet. You specify the template, of course, as well, the destination where to store the connection. But then you can here use this one like Excel. So you have to give it a name, of course, again. Current temperature. The OPC address. So have it here. Okay, this is copied. So I will copy the OPC address quickly. And the config ID. And this is like using Excel. So you can either do it here or, which is, I guess, the most commonly used way, you save this Excel template to your hard drive. And then you have this Excel sheet. You open it. And now here's the meaning here is, imagine you have thousands of connections. Then you can use the Excel functionality that is more intelligent. You have string concatenation, search and replace functionality, and all that. So you just have to imagine that there's the power of Excel to use when, using this. So I can just go ahead and anybody would now edit the Excel sheet here. Maybe current status is also available, I think. And then, so somebody creates that Excel sheet, saves it, and then you can just go ahead here to the OPC router, say create multiple instances, and you open that Excel sheet. You specify, of course, that template, then the storage location, what you want to do with the existing connections, and then you create them. Then you get a message. You see they were created here. So now I have 3 instances again. So I activate them. And finally have them here in the status again. So at some point they start again and will write data to the table. This is the most common used way, also was available in OPC router version 3, so maybe that's why. But a few versions ago, the developers added a third way. So I would just delete them. And done. So let's see here if there were there were some values. So yeah, and it was added to the database. So I delete it again. So the third way now is when I go to my template, is create a dynamic instance from template. This dynamic instance creates a container, as we call it, in your connections, under your connections, and at the same time, the name of the container will be used in the Inray local DB. So when you connect to the local DB of OPC router, you can use this connection string. You find it in the manual as well. When you connect to it, you see the local DB of the OPC router consisting of those or these three databases. So all the configuration that you see is stored here in this database. The runtime connections and all, whatever is needed is stored here in the runtime database. And then you have some values that are stored for analysis purposes, what you see in the state. And once we create a dynamic instance, it creates this container, as we call it, and at the same time, a table in the OPC router runtime. So that's what we expect is going to happen. So I just say right-click and create dynamic instance. Here you give it a name. So I say container instances, whatever. So it's a container for all your instances to a certain topic. I use this template and I want to store it here. I don't specify anything yet because I just want to create it. It did it. And now when you go back to connections, you find the container here. It's sort of a folder with a database sign here. You have to activate it once. I think just like this. And it will, restart the OPC router. So it's now passed to the OPC router runtime. And the runtime service should now set up a database. So now it's here. And in my OPC router runtime, I have the tables. I can refresh them. And there's the table. So it has the name of the folder, / and the container instances. This is the name of the instance I specified. And then they have a prefix. It's called API. So all containers that you create, of course, you would have a certain useful name that identifies the purpose of it. Will create its own table here on OPC router side, in the OPC router database, the local DB. So this is when you actually have to use the database of the local DB of OPC router. You usually wouldn't. So, but only use those API tables. Don't change the others. You can create store procedures. I will come back to that in a moment. But first of all, I haven't done any mistake now. I can create connections. So any client application, or as we will see later, I will create a REST service in OPC router, which then can be called from any REST client from external. We'll make inserts into this table. So now we don't have a client application, so I would just right-click, use my container table to create connections. The first instance name, as always, is current temperature, which can be a string here. The address is the same. A little bit further so you can see it. And the config ID will be 1. Okay, maybe I have to commit. Or just make it 1. Oh, that's why. So that should be okay. So I committed. Now I take another one, current amount. put it here and say it's this OPC tag, and it's a different number. So then I commit, and now I have two entries here in my database table. I only use the same as I was using before, the instance name, address, and config ID. It's the name of the placeholders, and of course a name for the child. So now it should have created here the connections in OPC router. So I have to refresh, and in my container, in the state, in the runtime, the OPC run service pulled that table, looking at it all the time, found two new connections, started them automatically, and now is transferring data again. So when I go to my table in the training database, there's data coming in again. So you just need some application that makes insert into this table, and it can be accessible from external applications. So, and yeah, my colleague Andrea and me, we thought we could make one example how maybe we can show how to make inserts into that table from external applications. So I will first delete them again. So that's the only way, by the way, to deactivate them. You delete them. There's no deactivation possible. Not necessary, so you can always truncate the table and insert in all connections that you want again, or program some logic as we did. So now, first of all, this should be gone. It is, so there's no connections anymore. Then I will just quickly delete my table. It's empty again. Yeah, what we thought is the following. I set up a REST full application. So the only thing what you do on OPC router side is you give it a name and a port. In case of encryption, you choose SSL, of course, and create a server certificate. And if you want to, then a basic authentication. Here we'll just have not encrypted without authentication, so that's it. I can go here to my connections to create a regular one. Say new connection, and this is my RESTful RP. So since it's a server, the REST functionality is located in the trigger. So this is my instance, and the endpoint is, yeah, whatever, process values. I allow the methods delete and post so they can send me new entries or delete an entry from the table. This is for this example. You can either have the client send a JSON in the request body and then pass that JSON and execute a stored procedure, for example, database side. Or in this case, I just tell him to give me the parameters for new connections in the HTTP header. So we had a current amount header. Could also use the URL to pass it, but I'm choosing the header. Then current temperature and yeah, current status. Or yeah, maybe I can go ahead and show the where we want to do it. So we'll open. So we created a stored procedure here. We call it just dynamic instance. And we, just a second, we said that an external application calls a REST service, giving us the instance name, OPC path, config ID, the method, which is either post or delete, and gets back a status code, for example. So this is actually what the external application should provide. That's what I meant. So I go here and say instance name, which is in the header, then the OPC item path, and yeah, what is it? Config ID, also in the header, and the method. So those three, the method is supplied automatically, but this is those three parameters that are necessary, the two placeholders and the name. What doesn't matter what we use, you can also define it to be JSON, the application format. No response at the moment. And then what we do is I have this stored procedure. So I have the process values, container instances. So, then, okay, it doesn't use it here. It's maybe I have to create it from here. Then just a second. I'll use this one. This should be okay then. Yeah. So it's here, and then so I'll try it. So since I had to change, misspelled the name, so now I should have the right name, and it should know the table at some point. Yeah. So yeah, I have a stored procedure that I want to call. So whenever the REST service is called, it passes me this information. Then I asked if the method is post. If so, I asked if I have already an entry for that instance name. If not, if it's not existing, then I make an insert. Otherwise, I just update it. And the other case would be a delete, and then I simply delete the entry in the table by that name. And otherwise, I raise an error. So that's the logic of it. And now I just have to go here and use the database. I have my local DB here. Choose stored procedure and have my dynamic instance. So I choose everything but the return value. Yeah, and now since I'm expecting, as in the HTTP header from the request, the instance name and the OPC item path and the config ID, as well as the method. And just for one example, I pass a status code back to the REST client. So now I can just activate this one. And then at some point it will get started here. Oh, it's not the wrong one. Forgot this. Post. And okay, so now again. So at some point it started and is accessible. Yeah, that should be the case now. So in the plugin settings for the REST, full application, I have a link to the Swagger user interface. So yeah, from English, yeah, from here, the Swagger environment gives me the documentation and the possibilities of this REST web service. So I want to do a post, just as an example. Then I see there are parameters, I can try it out. And then in the header, I give it an instance name again. So this is current temperature. The item path is then again here. And the ID is 1. So when I execute it, it's executed. Oh, got some error. What? Okay. Okay, it doesn't know the table. Let's see what the table name is. Okay, that's misspelled. Yeah, whatever. So then I will just quickly. So now I know I have the wrong table specified due to mistyped it. So but now it should be okay. So the OPC router tells me this procedure is made through an error. So now I do it again, go back, and I want to execute it again. So now I got a code 200, successful. And in the OPC router, there's a green entry. So now, when I go to this container table, then there's one entry made. And if I go here to the web service again, and I say current amount, and I change this to current amount, and another config ID. So an external REST call is executing this stored procedure, which has some logic, adds the data to my container. Now I have two connections, and the OPC router runtime has two connections again in that container. The name, of course, should be more sensible or meaningful. So yeah, this is, since the OPC router can act as a server when it comes to REST or OPC, this would be one way to simply fill those container instances dynamically from external applications. You set it up once, one template generated, and then just create an interface to via REST or OPC. So yeah, now we have data in here again in our application database. Which is the case. So yeah, as I said, this could also be done since we can be an OPC UA server since the last version. An OPC method could be done with or the OPC method trigger, of course. So an OPC UA client could provide the three values for instance name, OPC item path, and config ID by a method call, and then it's the same. The output from the method trigger would be linked to the stored procedure, which does the insert to the container table, and then it creates connections here. So that was basically all that we wanted to show you, the three ways of creating instances from a template and what it's used for. So mass generation or connections that are basically always the same and just some parameters are different. So yeah, that would be it. I think we can go on with questions and answers. So yeah, I would give the word back to Thorsten. Or
yeah, thank you very much, Jan. Are there any questions? I see there's just popped up one question in the chat. How do we know which template is used in a connection when there are many?
only by the folder. You would place the connections within a folder that has the same name of the template. So that's something we have to work on, I guess.
Okay. Is this the only question? We can maybe wait another 10 seconds. In the meantime, I can mention again. So if you would like to get more information or would like to have the recording of that webinar, you can send us a quick email at sales@inray.de or look on our OPC router websites and contact your local distributor